The fog of war. As Vladimir Putin continues his assault on Ukraine, the economic ramifications begin to unfold in Russia and around the rest of the world. This is Wall Street Week. I'm Romaine Bostic, in for David Weston. This week, special contributor Larry Summers on the direct impact of the sanctions and the ripple effects on financial markets around the globe.
They're delivering a real jolt to the Russian economy.
President Biden, in his first official State of the Union address, takes aim at Putin.
He thought he could roll into Ukraine and the world would roll over. Instead, he met with a wall of strength he never anticipated or imagined. He met the Ukrainian people.
As Russian forces continued to hammer buildings with missile strikes and heavy artillery, Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky vowed to fight on.
Our people are very much motivated, very much so. We are fighting for our rights, for our freedoms, for life, for our life. And now we're fighting for survival.
The escalation of the war leading to the escalation of commodity prices. Oil futures well above $100 a barrel, aluminum at record highs, and soft commodities like wheat trading at levels unseen in about a decade. That has put renewed attention on inflation, which was already rising at the fastest pace in generations, even before the war in Ukraine. Fed Chair Jerome Powell testifying before the House on Wednesday.
The near-term effects on the U.S. economy of the invasion of Ukraine, the ongoing war, with sanctions, and of events yet to come remain highly uncertain. This event does seem to be one that is a game changer and will be with us for a very long time.
Powell said that despite the geopolitical uncertainty, he still sees a case to move forward with raising benchmark interest rates at the central bank's March meeting, potentially by a quarter percentage point, and doesn't rule out larger raises down the line.
If we don't see inflation behaving as we expect it to behave, which is to peak and begin to come down, if we see inflation behaving in ways not consistent with that, then we're prepared to raise by more than that amount in a meeting or meetings.
All right, but let's get back to our top story here, the war in Ukraine, and of course, the global response, economic pushback, economic isolation. We are learning here that the White House is now considering rolling out new sanctions, potentially curbing imports of Russian oil. Let's go down to the White House where Washington correspondent Anne-Marie Horton is standing by. Anne-Marie, what do we know?
Well, Romaine, the administration has said it was always on the table, but they talked about how strategically it potentially wouldn't be smart because moving some more Russian oil from the market would see prices spike even higher. And as you just outlined, that just means more inflation and trickles down to the everyday American consumer at the gasoline pump. But now what Bloomberg News has learned exclusively is that they are considering this ban on Russian crude coming into the United States. Now, when you're just looking at crude by itself, it's about 3%. When you add in other products from that crude, it's about 8%. And Russia ranks third after Canada and Mexico in terms of those imports. But Romaine, on the diplomacy front, we should also point to the fact that we do have Antony Blinken over in Europe, going to be there this entire weekend. Today at Brussels, he was talking about the recklessness, him and other NATO allies, of Russia, especially given the attack on Europe's biggest nuclear facility. And over the weekend, he'll be going to a number of other countries, including Moldova, Poland, which has really become the center point for the humanitarian crisis of this war, as well as the Baltic states like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia.
All right, Bloomberg Chief Washington correspondent Anne-Marie Horton down there at the White House. Let's continue this conversation right now and bring in someone who knows a great deal about what's going on. Our next guest, she spent 3 years as Deputy Secretary General for NATO and also spent time at the State Department working on arms control and non-proliferation agreements. She's now a lecturer over at Stanford University. Rose Gottemoeller joining us right now. Rose, always great to get insight from someone with your depth of knowledge, someone who I guess has lived a life that has seen, I guess, the depths of the Cold War. You've obviously had a career that, of course, spanned the collapse of the Soviet Union now to where we are today. When you look at the economic pushback that Putin is seeing right now from pretty much every major nation out there here, do you think that those tactics are effective in and of themselves?
With Putin himself, I doubt it. He's happy with autarky, I think. He very much, I think, wants to close the doors of the outside world to Russia. He's certainly behaving that way. And he's never been, great in the field of economics. So I think he would be just as happy if Russia were totally cut off from the outside world and forced to be self-sufficient. That's certainly how he reacted after 2014 and the Russian invasion of Crimea. So I can see him not personally being very concerned about this, but the pressure on him is growing from his business community. And I also think from the public seeing their access to the internet, for example, shut off now. That has really become something the Russians depend on for communications, not only among themselves, but also with family abroad. So this is a tough moment.
There's a lot of talk about whether the economic sanctions will be enough to, I guess, reverse some of what Putin is doing here. But there have been a lot of calls now for some degree of a military response, particularly from NATO. We've heard from NATO officials today on this Friday, basically saying that they have no intention, at least right now, to enter into Ukrainian airspace or to put boots on the ground here. Do you think that that is a position that NATO can stand by?
I think the Secretary General Stoltenberg, was right when he spoke after the foreign ministers meeting today. NATO's biggest responsibility right now is to stop this invasion in Ukraine from becoming a general war in Europe, from becoming World War III. Nobody wants to see that. It's in nobody's interest to do so. And so I think it is extraordinarily important for NATO to help the Ukrainians in every way it can, both on the military front and also on the humanitarian front, but not to put boots on the ground and not to implement a no-fly zone. So I do think that has to be the top strategic objective for NATO right now, to avoid World War III.
There's also, of course, concerns about the nuclear issue here. We saw, of course, footage of what appeared to be an attack by Russian forces on a nuclear facility in Ukraine. That, of course, alarmed a lot of folks about the security of some of those facilities. What can be done, if anything, to ensure the security of those facilities?
Well, the Russians certainly know nuclear power plants. They built those VVRs along with the Ukrainians during the Soviet era, so they know them well, they understand them well. What worries me is that they're not taking a very responsible stance now toward attacking civilian targets of all kinds, especially, a nuclear power plant. So we really did dodge a nuclear bullet last night, I think. But it is, I think, nevertheless important to not only pay attention at an international level. Rafael Grossi, the Secretary General of the IAEA, Director General, speaking to the UN Security Council this morning, keeping those controls in place at an international level to the degree possible, and certainly the attention of the world at an international level. But then second, I think to remind the Russians that, in fact, if there were a nuclear accident at that plant, it could impact Russian territory. It could result in radiation contamination of Russian territory. Do they really want to see that in their most fertile farmland down there in the south of Russia? I don't think so. So it's in their interest to ensure also that this plant remains safe and secure and does not get attacked.
Barring, I guess, whatever initiatives that European countries and the U.S. can take to maybe fend off Putin here, is there any sense here that we could start to see maybe a little bit of a pushback from Russia's other neighbor, China?
Interesting, this week, the foreign minister of Ukraine called his foreign ministerial counterpart, the foreign minister of China, and they seem to come to some meeting of minds that China would start to facilitate diplomacy in this regard. I think, frankly, that could be a very interesting development. Certainly, there are ways in which China's economy will be affected by a continuing crisis in Ukraine. So I think there's an interest there for China to lend a helping hand. We'll see. Obviously, Beijing's walking a fine line. They don't want to completely, turn their back on Vladimir Putin. He's their main partner in many ways, but they also need to show that they're responsible players on the world stage, I think. So could be an interesting development for China to get involved.
Draw on your experience here. When people start talking about a new Cold War, is that overstated?
Well, there's a big difference from the Cold War. We were really cut off from each other during the Cold War in so many ways. The communications that led to the lack of communications that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago this year, ironically, it's much different now. We have many, many lines of communication open with Russia. You've seen Chancellor Scholz and President Macron calling Putin in the last couple of days we will stay in touch. We will continue. I think that gives us an opportunity for some intensified diplomacy and efforts to stop this terrible invasion. So if there's a ray of light and hope here, it's that this is not the Cold War.
All right, Rose, really appreciate getting your insights. Rose Gottemoeller, a lecturer over at the Stanford Institute and the former Deputy Secretary General over at NATO. Of course, we are focused on the humanitarian toll. We are also focused on the economic impact, the financial ramifications here, the ripple effects that we saw in markets this week. We'll discuss that when we come back. This is Wall Street Week. Welcome back to Wall Street Week. I'm Romaine Bostic, and what a week it has been. Volatility in some corners of the market at multi-year highs amid a global backlash to Russia's war in Ukraine. The most dramatic moves this week, they were in commodities. Oil at the highest level since 2008, aluminum hitting all-time highs, and wheat futures posting the biggest one-week percentage gain on record. The S&P 500 sank in 4 of the past 5 days. Dow Industrials dropped for a 4th straight week, and sentiment, well, it remains defensive, with investors gravitating to the safe haven of gold, the dollar, and treasuries. Now, with trouble seemingly everywhere, getting a handle on what comes next for financial markets and the global economy has been made that much harder. Joining us right now to hopefully help make sense of things is Mona Mahajan, Edward Jones, Senior Investment Strategist, and Joachim Fels, PIMCO Global Economic Advisor. Welcome to both of you. And Joachim, I'll start with you here. This has been an incredible 2 weeks here, not only because of the human toll here and all of the fears we have about warfare, but the economic ripple effects. We're starting to see that both from the war and the economic sanctions.
Yeah, well, Romaine, this is clearly a stagflationary shock. I mean, just like COVID, this is an unprecedented situation. So the next big shock, this war is clearly stagflationary. So it's pushing up energy prices. It is aggravating the supply disruptions. There are actually new supply disruptions, both in the transport of oil from Russia, but also in land transport, for example, from China to Europe, which partly goes via rail through Russia. So that's been blocked. So it's clearly inflationary in the near term, and it is stagnation or even recessionary, particularly for the European economy. So obviously Europe will be much more affected by this than the US, but even the US is not immune from this shock.
Mona, are you also thinking about stagflation right now?
You know, I agree with Joachim that this shock has stagflationary impulses to it. But I also would emphasize the global disparity that we're seeing. Clearly, the U.S. coming into this crisis was likely in better shape, both from the health of the consumer and the health of an economy overall. Keep in mind, the consumer is still flush with cash from the COVID pandemic stimulus, about $2.5 trillion in excess savings from the consumer in the U.S. To deal with the higher oil prices, the higher food prices, and some of those supply chain shocks that Joachim alluded to. We're seeing this play out in markets as well. We're seeing Europe, which is more exposed from both energy and trade to the Russia-Ukraine crisis. European markets have been down 8-9% this week alone versus U.S. markets down 1% to 2%. We're seeing credit spreads really widen more dramatically in Europe than in the U.S. And so generally, I'd say when you list those flight to safety asset classes, perhaps more broadly, the U.S. asset class in general has become a little bit of a safety play here as well.
The reaction, though, Mona, to geopolitics, there's always been this discussion here that there's a knee-jerk reaction and things sort of smooth themselves out. Things feel a little bit different this time with regards to the way people have positioned.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think markets never like uncertainty. We know that. And we came into this crisis actually with 2 overhangs. One, what is the Federal Reserve going to do? And 2, how will this war in Ukraine now play out? Of course, we got a little bit of clarity from the Fed this week and Jerome Powell. Markets are still waiting for clarity from this overhang. How long will it take? How high can oil prices go? Really, what is the off-ramp here? And so in that those buckets of uncertainty, you really have to think about during this period of time, it really does make sense to perhaps hide out in some of those safe haven plays. We've seen gold, the dollar, Treasury bonds, all really that flight to safety asset class. Until we get clarity, and we're hopeful when you look at history, geopolitical crises do tend to resolve themselves over time and usually within a quarter or so. And so once we move past this, we get a little bit of clarity, we can then start to handicap what those stagflationary impacts will be on the economy and which economies will suffer more or less.
Well, Joachim, how are we looking at the global economy now? It seemed a few weeks ago there was at least some discussion about some degree of synchronization with regards to the economic picture here. Do we now need to start thinking of the global economy in different blocks in a way that maybe we weren't prepared to do a few weeks ago?
I think we do, Romain. I think what we're seeing here is more differentiation between growth and maybe even inflation outcomes between the US and Europe. The US economy is obviously still very strong. The payroll report today confirmed this. Europe was just about to reaccelerate. Demand was about to reaccelerate as the economy has been reopening after the Omicron wave has been subsiding. Now, there's a big question mark over that. I think there is a risk of a technical recession in Europe later this year, the longer this conflict in Ukraine lasts. And then you have China, which is, again, on a very different trajectory. China has been slowing quite sharply over the past year. It has recently eased policy. So you also have a policy divergence. The Fed is starting to hike rates, whereas in China, monetary policy has recently been easing. There is also fiscal easing, there is credit easing going on, and we could see a slight reacceleration of Chinese growth in the course of this year. So this is really a very differentiated story around the world. Yeah. We're really on very different tracks between Europe, the US, and also China.
If we do start to see a significant downturn in both Europe and in China, Joachim, how much does that drag down the U.S.? Is it going to be a little bit different than maybe what we saw in previous cycles?
Well, I think it's definitely a drag on U.S. growth, but not a very large one. The reason is that most of the growth acceleration in the U.S. this year is driven by the reopening of the economy, by pent-up demand that is still there, by a very strong labor market that is supporting growth as we're creating more jobs. So this is much more led by domestic demand than by global factors. Also, the U.S. is a net exporter of energy these days. So while higher energy prices hit consumers, at the same time it benefits the energy sector in the U.S. So the overall effect on the economy is much, much smaller than it is for Europe and also for China and other oil importers. So I think the U.S. is not immune, but it will clearly outperform both Europe and also China this year.
All right, I want to also get your thoughts on some of the recent economic data. Sit tight. We do need to take a break. In conversation right now with Mona Mahajan and Joachim Fels. They'll be sticking with us as we come back. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm Romain Bostic in for David Weston, and we're starting to see some broad-based hiring going on here in the U.S. The latest jobs data came out Friday morning, and it was well above expectations. Mona Mahajan of Edward Jones still with us, as is Joachim Fels over at PIMCO, Global Economic Advisor. Mona, I want to start with you and get your sense here of the jobs data that we got this morning and whether you start to see, I guess, a little bit more, something more encouraging about the pace of economic growth here in the United States.
Yeah, look, this was clear upside for the jobs numbers this morning. You know, I think positive on many fronts. One, not only are we seeing the unemployment rate fall now to 3.8%, so probably the tightest labor market we've seen through this cycle. We're also seeing labor participation start to tick up. So workers are coming back to the workforce. What was encouraging to us is that we saw a lot of those low-wage jobs really pick up, which means that some of those supply chain issues that we've been talking about, a lot of that supply chain disruption is because we cannot get workers to enact that last mile. You know, you order from Amazon, you need a trucker or a driver to deliver it to you. We're starting to finally see some of those workers come back to the workplace, perhaps as that Omicron variant is fading, but also perhaps as some of the stimulus checks start to wane as well. Also keep in mind the big one, wage growth, which is a signal of inflation. We were up 5.1% year on year, still quite strong in terms of wage growth, but well below expectations of 5.8%. So, to us, that's also a little bit of a sigh of relief for the Fed, who's been watching inflation numbers like hawks. Perhaps they can breathe a little bit easier knowing that they can start with that 25 basis point rate hike as well. So overall, I'd say generally good on all fronts and kind of underscores that health of the consumer, as we've noted earlier in the segment.
So, Joachim, on that front, though, I mean, we're going to get another CPI report next week here, even with some of the maybe potential moderation that we're seeing in some of the data here. Do you think that the Fed's decision, or at least what they've communicated so far with regards to raising rates at least by 25 basis points and obviously ending quantitative easing, do you think that that's still appropriate given what we know so far?
Yeah, I think the Fed is really focused on inflation for now. I think the jobs report that we had gives further ammunition for the beginning of the rate hike cycle. Job growth was very strong, as discussed. And yes, wage growth was a little bit more moderate than expected. So there was a little bit of Goldilocks in the report, but it was still 5.1%. Also, the CPI numbers that we get next week are likely to show a further increase in headline inflation, given what energy prices have done and food prices have done, and also a further uptick in core inflation. So I think the Fed is really determined to go. This is what Jay Powell told us again in the testimony this week. The Fed's reaction function can really be described by three things: inflation, inflation, and inflation. That's what they're focused on. So I think they are preparing a series of rate hikes. And then maybe even more importantly for markets, the beginning of the balance sheet runoff from about the middle of this year.
Do you think, with regards to the rate hikes, though, do you think that they need to be as aggressive as the market seems to think they will be, 6 or 7 hikes this year? Do you think the Fed can be gradual?
I think 6 to 7 hikes, which is what most people in the market see, is a little bit aggressive to us. I think 4 or 5 rate hikes this year is quite realistic. I think they want to get in a series in the next several meetings. So the next 3 to 4 meetings, you'll probably see 25 basis points each, unless something happens on the way. But overall, I think given that the balance sheet rundown will be another focus by the Fed, I think they will then slow the pace of tightening on rates during the second half as they begin a fairly fast balance sheet runoff. And then the other thing we should remember is that as the Fed starts tightening, usually bad stuff starts to happen. You never know where exactly, but the risk of a financial accident is rising, particularly with the balance sheet runoff.
Mona, I want to give you the last word. We only have about 45 seconds here. I am curious as how you think the market will react to this, if that is indeed what the Fed does.
Yeah, generally I think the market is ready now for a 25 basis point rate hike. I think they'll be curious to see what the economic projections are from the Fed, especially around inflation. Clearly, the risks are now for higher inflation, at least headline inflation, over the next few months. The question really is, as we get towards the back half of the year, do we see inflation moderating? And, of course, we get base effects that are rising. Year-on-year comps get tougher. We may start to see oil prices finally start rolling over the other way. And so, Joachim's point of 4 to 5 rate hikes, I think the next 4 to 5 meetings are live, and then we pause, see where we are, and perhaps if inflation is in better shape, we get a more gradual pace going forward.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Always wonderful to catch up with both of you. Mona Mahajan over at Edward Jones, Joachim Fels over at PIMCO. This is Wall Street Week. We'll be back in a moment.
I understand our top priority must be getting prices under control. Look, Our economy roared back faster than most predicted. But the pandemic meant that businesses had a hard time hiring enough workers to keep up and production in their factories. The pandemic also disrupted the global supply chains.
President Joe Biden there reiterating a theme that he brought up in his State of the Union address on Tuesday night. Welcome back to Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm Romaine Bostick in for David Weston. The president, of course, talking a lot about inflation and some of the other issues that he has to address here. And I guess the big question right now really is how it goes over with the American people. Joining us right now, let's bring in Andy Blocker, Invesco Global Head of Public Policy and Head of U.S. Government Affairs. Andy, great to talk with you here. You talk about a president who came into office in probably one of the more polarizing times, at least in my lifetime here. He was not necessarily a popular president, despite winning the popular vote. I am curious as to how the public reaction has been to his handling of recent events, whether it's inflation, whether it's Ukraine, and everything else in between.
Well, Romaine, coming into the State of the Union this past Tuesday, he came in with his lowest approval ratings on record so far, 39% according to the NPR poll. And you know, he really needed the speech to reset the narrative for his presidency. And both flash polls right after the speech show it was very well received, though 70% approving of the speech. And we expected about a 3 to 4 point bump for his approval rating, but he actually got an unusually high bounce of over 8%. And so he's now at 47% in the NPR poll. He also was doing well with respect to handling of Ukraine. He got an 18-point bump up to 52% for handling of COVID. He went from 47 to 55%, and handling the economy, which is the ultimate question, he got an 8-point bump up to 45%.
But how long does something like that last? I mean, does that stick?
That's the real question. And unfortunately for President Biden, a lot of this is out of his control. If you look at the main issues we're dealing with today, well, while he can handle the Ukraine situation the best he can, he's not really in control of that situation. If you look at inflation, he can do things with supply chain, et cetera, but he can't really control inflation. If you look at fighting crime in your neighborhoods, he can't control that, but he can talk about what he's doing to help, but he really can't control it. So it's not really in his control.
It's certainly not in his control. And of course, as I'm sure you know, presidents get blamed for a lot of things that they shouldn't get blamed for. And then, of course, they get a lot of credit for things that they probably shouldn't get credit for. There's going to be a counter narrative here from the Republican Party, particularly heading into a midterm election season here. What is that counter narrative right now?
Well, the counter narrative from the Republicans is going to be that President Biden did not prevent war in Ukraine. President Biden, while he got out of Afghanistan like the American people wanted, the way in which he got out was not the way he did. And then also inflation. This is his fault. He's passed all these bills, spending all this money. That's their narrative. He's trying to counter that by saying, look, I did these things to fight COVID. I did these things to get American people back to work. And also with Ukraine, I'm doing all I can. In fact, you can credit me for uniting NATO against Putin, even though it's Putin who actually did what no one else could do by invading Ukraine. He united NATO, made it stronger, got countries like Switzerland to abandon their neutrality stance, and also getting Sweden and Finland to actually consider joining NATO. So it's a combination, but the Republicans are definitely going to come after him on a lot of those issues.
Does foreign policy matter that much to voters these days?
Foreign policy matters most with respect to whether or not the president is showing strength in leadership as a commander in chief, and it shows that he has a firm hand on the till in representing America. And so I think while Afghanistan and the way the withdrawal happened there, that did not show him strong and it embarrassed the United States. But with Ukraine, him being able to unite the allies in Europe and to be able to push back on Putin with strong sanctions, I think has shown him to be strong. So the jury's out in the long term, but I think right now he's doing pretty well as of this week.
But some of the options that he's taken so far with regards to the economic sanctions, there is, of course, always the risk that there is a ripple effect that comes back here into the U.S. economy, primarily through inflation, whether it's higher gas prices or higher food prices or just general economic instability here. How does he buffet against that?
Well, let's go to the potential oil ban that a lot of Republicans and Democrats, including Nancy Pelosi, have been in favor of. The reason that the administration has been resistant to that is because they do not want any more shock into gas prices, especially in this inflationary environment. So their argument is, hey, we want to put as much pain on Russia as possible and minimize the pain on the American people. Because at the beginning, the American people might be behind such an oil ban, but if it impacts their day-to-day, going to their groceries, their gas prices, they're not going to be in favor of it. So it's a short-term gain, but long-term potential pain, depending on how it rolls out.
But we've already seen substantial gains at the gas pump, particularly since he's taken office now. Whether he should be blamed for that is certainly debatable, but it's real, it's tangible. A lot of people who go to the grocery store, they look at the prices on that receipt and they realize they're paying a lot more today than what they were paying for just a few months ago here. Is there anything more than just a narrative that he can do that's going to make people, I guess, at least feel, if not better about the situation, at least like it's not his fault or his party's fault?
Yeah, that's a tough one, Romaine. And so, look, he's going to have a lot of people who are very much in favor of him doing, strategic petroleum reserve, which he already did, but that's a short-term thing. Talking about supply chain and helping with that, but that takes too long to actually be felt. The thing he needs to hope for, and like I said, it's out of his control, is that we have reached that part in our cycle where by the second quarter, inflation will have peaked. The problem is that the Ukraine situation has destabilized everything. And you've seen with cargo prices going up, with air cargo prices going, with not being able to fly over Russian territory. There's all kinds of uncertainties that are entering the market right now, and we're just in a very uncertain time.
Do you see any sort of risk of military involvement, military escalation?
So there's always a risk, Romaine, but I think as you've seen from President Biden, repeatedly from the NATO secretary as well, they've all been very clear that we want to support President Zelensky and the Ukrainians as much as we can without actually putting boots on the ground and getting directly involved. And so I think as long as there's no direct involvement, I think it's more unlikely that we actually have a wider spread. But you never know. I mean, with President Putin and people questioning where he is right now mentally, he may be trying to poke the bear with NATO, going into Poland and having flight incursions. Anything can happen. There could be something can happen. I think NATO and President Biden is very focused on not having the spread, and that's why there hasn't been a commitment to actually put troops on the ground.
The other big foreign policy issue, at least one of the big unresolved foreign policy issues, is, of course, the relationship with China, at least the trade relationship and economic relationship, a relationship that still remains frayed. And now, of course, with Russia's incursion into Ukraine, it's raising a lot of questions about where China will stand and whether there is a future for economic ties, stronger economic ties between the U.S. and China.
Yes, that is one of the biggest issues that we've been watching and others have been watching, because China is doing a couple things. Number one, they're watching very closely what's going on here, and they're kind of extrapolating to what does that mean for us vis-a-vis if we ever want to go into Taiwan. So they're watching this, and I think they've seen a lot of strength from America and the European allies to actually respond. The other part is that while they want to stay close to Russia, they don't want a lot of the what's the word? They've been, I mean, basically right now, Russia is a rogue state. They're vilified in the world community, and they want to avoid that at all costs. So you can see them trying to walk that tightrope of doing enough to help Russia, but not being seen as this Russian ally and letting Russia do whatever it wants.
We started off talking about the president's approval ratings, about the polarization here in the United States with regards to politics here. Is it possible at all that the situation going on right now in Ukraine and the global reaction to it, that this could actually be not just a unifying force for the developed world, but actually a unifying force within our own borders?
So I think you make a great point. Number one, like I said before, it has unified NATO in ways we've never seen. We see the Germans now actually trying to fulfill its 2% military commitment of its GDP to its military as part of NATO. You've seen people wanting to join NATO. And then at home, at the beginning of the speech, the State of the Union speech, you definitely saw President Biden rallying everyone. You saw Republicans and Democrats unified behind the crisis in Ukraine. And I think there are things from that he can take and move forward. The problem, Romaine, is that we're in the middle of election season. We have midterm elections coming up in November. And while this will last for a little bit, you've already seen it break off a little bit with respect to the oil prices, even though some Democrats support it. They're going to be looking for ways in which to distinguish themselves in Congress from the president to make gains in November.
All right, Andy, always great to catch up with you. Great insights from Andy Blocker there, Invesco Global Head of Public Policy and Head of U.S. Government Affairs. Coming up, we're going to end the week with Wall Street Week contributor and former U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers. That's coming up next. This is Wall Street Week. Welcome back to Wall Street Week. With the war in Ukraine still unfettered, economic sanctions broadening around the world, and commodity inflation following, a lot of concerns right now about how various governments can insulate their populations from some of the ripple effects from this. Joining us right now is Wall Street Week special contributor Larry Summers, Harvard professor and former Treasury Secretary. And Larry, I do want to start off with the Treasury Department and some of the sanctions that we heard from earlier this week out of the Treasury, and whether the moves that the Treasury Department has made right now are enough.
Look, I think they're taking constructive and appropriate steps. I think they've done more damage to the Russian economy more quickly than most people would have expected. You've got pervasive bank run type phenomena going on in Russia. So they're delivering a real jolt to the Russian economy, and they're delivering a real jolt, especially to those close to President Putin. What that's going to mean for the orders President Putin is giving is anyone's guess. That we would see the kind of attacks on nuclear power plants risking a Chernobyl-style meltdown that we've seen over the last 24 hours is shocking. And I don't think anybody can be certain what is in President Putin's mind, and that makes this such a dangerous situation. But I think we have to be proud of the way the United States has been able to mobilize an alliance across Europe, indeed an alliance across the world, to respond to this situation more quickly and more vigorously and with more unity than almost anyone would have expected.
And that's the response now coming out of the U.S. Of course, this does make the job a little bit harder for Jerome Powell and the policymakers at the Federal Reserve. We heard from Jerome Powell this week on Capitol Hill. He did basically say that they're keeping an eye on the situation in Ukraine, but at least in his words, he doesn't think that that's going to derail the playbook that the Fed has already laid out. Do you anticipate that?
Look, I'm not going to speak for the Federal Reserve. I think the Fed had a very hard problem because it was behind the curve on inflation beforehand. And now this major adverse supply shock in the form of higher oil, higher commodity prices generally, which, by the way, should not be blamed on what we are doing. It should be blamed on what President Putin is doing. That's going to make the task of engineering a soft landing that much more difficult for the American economy. So I think the employment risks and the inflation risks are very grave right now, and it's going to be a very delicate task of policy to try to contain inflation while maintaining stable economic growth. It's possible that the Fed will be able to pull it off, but there are very substantial risks on both sides, on the inflation side and on the cyclical downturn side.
Well, I guess that's the question, though. When you look at the additional inflationary pressures that have basically been added to the equation over the last couple of weeks here, is monetary policy an effective tool to tamp that down?
Monetary policy is an effective tool, but it may not be an effective tool without engineering a slowdown in the economy. The last dot plot has the Fed believing that three things are going to happen together. that inflation's going to fall below 3, unemployment's going to stay well below 4, and interest rates are never going to go above 2.5. I don't think those things are all likely to happen together. And so the Fed's going to have to make some very difficult choices. I think that there's much more danger that we're going to do too little to contain inflation than there is danger that we're going to do too much. I think we're now facing real risks of a 1970s type scenario, not quite as high levels of inflation as we saw in the 1970s, but the same kind of broad phenomena of stagflation. And that is in part a response to the very bad break we've gotten from the geopolitics and what's happening with oil and commodities, but it's also a response to the excessive stimulation of the economy during 2021.
Well, how do you compare when you look at the economy today and you look at, I guess, some of the strength that we're seeing there, whether it's in consumer spending? We had an employment report out earlier this morning that showed a significant jump in growth in jobs, as well as, of course, a drop in the unemployment rate here. At least by those measures, this is still a pretty strong economy. And I'm wondering, how does that compare to where we were in the 70s when that stagflation hit? Was the economy sort of moving at the same pace that we're moving now?
Economy was strong coming out of the 1975 recession, and combination of supply shocks and overheating led to a very serious inflation situation. The key variable that I'm watching in the U.S. economy right now is tightness in the labor market. And what I'm seeing is vacancies at record levels, quits at record levels. I think we've got a labor market that historically would have corresponded to 2% unemployment. And the labor market is getting tighter, not easier. And so that tells me we're likely to see acceleration, not deceleration, in wage inflation. And since labor is by far the biggest cost factor in the economy, ultimately that's got to show through to prices. And that's why I think we've got a very complicated problem of policy management.
What breaks that cycle? What breaks it down?
Yeah, it's possible that we'll get some breaks on commodities, that some of the places where there have been bottlenecks, we'll see bottleneck easing, that inflation will come down, that nobody's really expecting a ratcheting up of inflation. And so with low inflation expectations and with a decline in bottleneck inflation, the situation will solve itself with modest action by the Fed and the passage of time. That kind of soft landing certainly is possible. It's not what I expect, but I don't preclude the possibility. I think in policymaking, what you need to do is hope for the best and plan for the worst. And so I think we need to be recognizing the real possibility that without a significant slowdown in the U.S. economy, we're likely to have inflation be unanchored 2 years from now. And so the Fed is likely to have to make very, very difficult choices.
What do you think about the communication from the president himself coming out of that State of the Union address? Do you think he made that case?
I think the president was very powerful on the Ukraine issue, and I think ultimately that is the issue of this moment. I think President Biden needs to make a transition that is in some ways similar to the one that President Roosevelt made. At some point, Franklin Roosevelt famously said, "I'm no longer Dr. New Deal. Now I'm Dr. Win the War." And I think that President Biden is going to have to make a transition from being President middle class to being President preserve democracy. And that's going to be a very fundamental transition that the administration needs to make. I think that process started in the State of the Union, but it's got a ways to go.
All right, Larry, until next week, special contributor Larry Summers there, former Treasury Secretary, Harvard University professor. This is Wall Street. Welcome back to Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. It's been more than a week now since Russia invaded Ukraine, and the voices of the world's leaders have been mostly unified in condemnation. Let's listen to what they had to say throughout the week, starting with President Biden at the State of the Union.
Vladimir Putin sought to shake the very foundations of the free world, thinking he could make it bend to his menacing ways. But he badly miscalculated. He thought he could roll into Ukraine and the world would roll over. Instead, he met with a wall of strength he never anticipated or imagined. He met the Ukrainian people.
I spoke with Biden, President Biden, yes, I think yesterday or day before yesterday, I don't remember. And we have good contact. I can tell the truth. And it's a pity that it began after the beginning of this war, but we have it, and my appreciation to him and to his team. And so we can speak now often.
Hundreds of Ukrainian civilians have already been killed. Women and children were killed again today. The coming days will most probably be increasingly tougher.
What we have seen already from Vladimir Putin's regime in the use of the munitions that they have already been dropping on innocent civilians, Mr. Speaker, in my view, already fully qualifies as a war crime.
I think that President Putin has really made the decision to take over the not only the city, but take over the country. So neutrality, if it was an option, is no longer an option.
It's just amazing to see the diabolical actions taken by Putin as he has complete disregard for sovereignty, democracy, or human life, including civilian lives.
It hasn't been decided yet what would happen if the Russians withdrew. Again, that'd be part of whatever kind of diplomacy would unwind the crisis in Ukraine. Sadly, this, as you say, is a hypothetical question. We see no signs, unfortunately, that the Russians have any intention of withdrawing right now. And indeed, their military operations in Ukraine continue to escalate.
Все поставленные задачи успешно решаются.
Unprovoked, unjustified, and a war that is having horrific consequences for real people, for mothers, for fathers, for children. We see the images on TV, and it has to stop.
Clearly, the Ukrainians have done very, very well up to this point, but it's the first inning in a 9-inning ball game. But it is still tough, brutal combat in a way that we haven't seen yet. And the Russians will just continue to hammer and hammer and hammer away at you in places such as cities. They don't worry about casualties. They don't worry about collateral damage. They don't worry about infrastructure.
The American people are absolutely concerned about what's going on. They know that this could very well lead to a third world war.
That does it for Wall Street Week. I'm Romaine Bostick. Please join us next week.